Here are instructions for lab number 12, Minerals and Economics. The first thing you need to do is understand this diagram. This is a plot showing GDP, which is gross domestic product per capita, versus consumption per capita. So what do these different things mean? GDP is basically the value of all the goods and services produced in a given period of time in a country, and this is all separated by country. It's thought of to be a reliable indicator of the economic performance of that country. So higher GDP means more goods are being sold, and so people are making more money. Now, the per capita part means per person, and that way you can compare countries with smaller populations to countries with bigger populations on this graph. So this is across the bottom. And notice that this is a logarithmic scale. Countries that are down on this end of the spectrum have a low GDP, and as you move to the right, countries over here have a high GDP. The other axis is consumption per capita. In particular, this graph is showing consumption of industrial minerals and ores and construction materials. So the higher a country is on this axis, which is also logarithmic, the more new construction is implied to be going on. That country is growing its infrastructure. And again, that's been done per capita, so that countries with really different populations can be paired. So countries that are up here near the top have high consumption rates per capita, and those that are at the bottom have low. So these countries are all listed in here. India is right here on this line. They're pointing to it because it's part of the questions that you're going to see in the lab. And then you can see that there's some color coding to help you see entire continents. So Africa is represented by red squares, Asia by green diamonds, etc. So the first question asks you to provide the names of two countries that consume approximately the same amount of resources. So basically they have the same consumption rate, but have very different per capita GDPs. And so an example I'm going to give you is China and Denmark. So China is right here on the graph, and then Denmark is over here. So China and Denmark are at about the same position in terms of their consumption rates. However, Denmark has a much higher GDP than China. So you should give me an answer that is not China and Denmark, but you should give me another answer. The next question asks for two countries that have approximately the same GDP per capita, but widely varying consumption rates. And so this time we're looking at countries that are aligned in this direction. And an example I have here is Equatorial Guinea and Peru. So here's Equatorial Guinea in that red square. Peru is kind of lost in here, but it's right in here. And they have very similar GDPs, but Peru consumes a lot more material, and that's implied to be good, healthy, new construction in comparison to Equatorial Guinea. So you're going to give me a different pair in this question than what I gave you. It then says, despite the pairs noted above, use the trend line in figure 1 to describe the overall relationship between a country's wealth and the amount of resources they use. And so that trend line in figure 1 is this line right here. So this is the best fit line to the data. And it's got a positive slope, right? It's showing when one variable increases, the other increases. That's what I want you to summarize here is what is the overall trend indicated by that line. I then ask, is India more or less developed than most Latin American and Caribbean countries? So India, again, is in here. Latin American and Caribbean countries are in this light green color with this triangle on its side. And so you can kind of see where they are. They're distributed sort of in this part of the graph, and then you're going to compare them to India. Finally, it says, using this trend, predict what would happen if India's economy grew. So if India's economy grew, which means it's going to be moving to a higher number in the GDP per capita category, what's going to happen to the total consumption rate? What would you predict for India? The next page asks you about these figures, and I know they're small and there's a lot of them, but I'm going to walk you quickly through them. They're shown for North America in this column, South America here, and India. And what they're showing are consumption and extraction trends. So we didn't talk about extraction on the previous slide, but extraction means how much is being taken out of the ground. The first row here refers to base metals. If you look down here, base metals include aluminum, copper, lead, and zinc. They all go from 1970 to 2005. So in North America, we had a pretty steady level of extraction from our own ground of these materials. Our consumption, though, has always been higher, and it seems to actually be increasing as we get closer to the present. In South America, they've been consuming quite a bit less than they've been extracting, so they've probably been exporting a lot of their materials. In India, there seems to be a match between consumption and extraction until about 1987 or 88, and then they began to extract more than they were actually consuming, so they probably exported those. Let's look at the next row, iron and steel, which is used frequently in buildings. In North America, they once again consumed more than they extracted, and this difference seems to have grown in the more recent times. South America, again, has extracted much more of these materials than it's used. And India has also extracted more of these materials than it has used, although the consumption is going up. Finally, we have NPK, which stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These three elements are the components of fertilizer. How much fertilizer they use is related to how much food is being grown. In North America, they're consuming much less than they're extracting. In South America, they're consuming and extracting about the equal amount until about 1980, and then they've been consuming more than they're extracting. So that means they're importing some. In India, we see a steady climb in both of these variables, with consumption always outpacing extraction. So they also have to import materials. So the next set of questions then asks you about those graphs. First of all, describe the trends in consumption from the early to the more recent times in all three regions. So I kind of went through those graphs by material. I'm asking you to summarize by location. So give me an overall statement for North America's consumption, and then South America's, and then India's. Give a possible explanation for the trends in consumption in India, in North America. So above you describe the trends, and now here you're interpreting the trends. And then finally, India currently uses more this should be NPK than South America, even though India is less developed. Why might this be the case? And I've inserted this population chart here of India, North America, and South America to help you think about the answers for questions 7 and 8. The last part of the lab asks you to watch a TED video, which is listed here. It's about 10 minutes long. And they suggest that you read through these questions before you watch it so you kind of know what you're looking for. The first question asks you to write down 10 items that you own that you feel you need in our modern society, but that are maybe in excess of true basic survival. Number 2 says circle any items that you think are likely to be owned by someone in an impoverished country. Number 3, in what ways might population growth affect mineral resource extraction and use? Explain your answer. And so these questions keep in mind while you're watching the video, and then you should be able to answer them a little bit better. But some of them are your opinions. Number 4, Rosling in this TED Talk foresees an end to population growth. What factors does Rosling cite as reasons why population will stop growing? And he talks about how an increase in child survival rate and a decrease in birth rate are the key. So what it's asking you is what factors will lead to those results? And then finally, in what ways might increased economic development, which means more impoverished countries becoming more emerging economies, and emerging economies moving into being more developed countries, how is that going to affect mineral resource extraction and use? So these are questions that you should think about. Put down an answer that makes sense to you. You can do a little research if you want. But that's the lab. It's a pretty quick lab, and that's why this lab and the next lab are kind of squeezed into 1 week. The next lab will be lab number 13, and I'll be giving you a video for that one soon too.